Hello, everyone. My name is Daniel Feeney, and I'm a senior finance manager within our Microsoft Cloud Finance team. I'm joined today by Jeff Emmels, who's a senior business planner within our Microsoft Cloud marketing team. Today, we're going to be doing a Q&A session on cloud economics. We're going to be walking through some of the core financial and technical tips for a cloud migration, and we're going to be having a Q&A dialogue with Azure experts. Throughout this section, we're going to discuss some of the basic differences between technical and some of the technical differences and financial differences between an on-premise and a cloud infrastructure. One of the key things today is to think about how the economic impact changes when you go from an on-premise environment to a cloud-based environment. And so we'll open up for Q&A to talk about things like capex to opex shifts and other important financial KPI changes. Throughout the question today, you'll have the opportunity to use the chat window to ask questions. These questions will appear to all attendees once they've been approved by the moderator. The experts will either answer questions verbally or via the chat, and they'll be determined by the moderator. Experts will also provide resources once the session is concluded so that you're able to learn more. Just as a reminder, the session may be recorded, and in order to help our moderators, please don't spam or have any inappropriate comments within the chat. Additionally, please make sure you ensure you adhere to the Microsoft Code of Conduct. As a brief introduction, my name is Daniel Feeney, and I'm a senior finance manager within our Microsoft Cloud Finance team. I work with our customers very closely to help them understand and assess the economic impact of going from on-premise to cloud. I'll frequently work with our customers to do financial analyses to understand what is the economic impact and the financial impact of migrating workloads from an on-premise environment to a cloud-based environment. I really love working through and diving into the technical and the financial considerations of a cloud migration. I'll hand it over to Jeff now to introduce himself briefly and to walk through some of the key topics of a cloud economics transformation.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. My name is Jeff Emmels, and I am a senior business planner out of the Microsoft Cloud Marketing Organization. I've been with Microsoft for going a little over 23 years now. And I don't necessarily classify myself as a business planner, but more so of a data center architect that likes to do his own taxes. In essence, representing technical evolutions and modernization of workloads from on-premise data centers and helping customers through the complexity of modernizing from a technical perspective as well as a financial perspective, because the two influencers are heavily intertwined. So I have the pleasure of working with Daniel from the Microsoft Finance side very often, and we're helping customers sort through some of that complexity and create longer-term plans. So before we dive into some of the open Q&A, we just wanted to share a little bit of snippets of information. Feel free to start putting questions into the chat window. Don't hesitate. But first, I want to start with that. The fact that the cloud value, the value you get out of moving your workloads to the cloud and deprecating your on-premise data center resources go beyond just the cost, the fiduciary aspect. The cloud enables you to have other abilities like high availability and agility and the dynamic nature of deploying workloads as well as deprovisioning workloads when they're not functioning the way you exactly want or want to deliver to a business unit. It's aspects like that that help you deliver services to business units faster and potentially increase your revenue margins in the longer term. So keep that in mind as we go through the discussion. But when we start thinking about the financial aspects and the technical aspects and benefits that map to it, certainly those are more quantifiable values, and we'll dive into some of those throughout our discussion today. So when we start thinking about the benefits of a cloud, we have two larger categories, one being the technical benefits and second being the financial benefits. So in the technical benefits, some of which I've mentioned are the scalability and availability aspects. Scalability where you could deploy resources that historically you would have to provision bare metal for and plan for on the budgetary from a budgetary perspective to actually acquire the gear, purchase the gear and deploy it and deliver it to the business units. As well as availability, you have to think about the whole higher fault tolerance of your architecture and the having that representative in your overall financials. And then additional technical benefits are security and compliance, as well as even capacity optimization, where in real time you could potentially right-size your workloads or scale up or scale down your workloads on demand. And then from the financial benefits perspective, I'm going to hand it back to Daniel, and he'll touch on a couple of those points, and then we'll start looking for questions as we move forward.
Thanks, Jeff. And absolutely, from a technical perspective, those benefits are real and they can be very tangible. But it's not just a digital transformation that's going on when you're moving from on-prem to cloud. It often goes hand in hand with a financial transformation. One of the key things to consider from a financial perspective is when you move to the cloud, you gain additional flexibility. You're moving away from a fixed infrastructure, a fixed cost structure with upfront spend to something that's over time. And so really one of the core benefits that you get from moving to the cloud is you offload all of that lead time, all of the pre-provisioning, the provisioning for peaks that you had to do on premise. You're able to offload that and spin up resources as you need them. From a select benefits perspective, there's a few really core ones that we think are just critical. One is the opex pricing model, which allows you to move from upfront spend to overtime spend. And often we'll get a lot of questions, and we'll touch on this hopefully in the Q&A. Capex to opex. What is the shift? How might it impact different KPIs? What is my economic impact going to be? It's a very critical conversation, but we want to make sure we consider it from the right lens. And so it's absolutely, I think, a core benefit of moving to the cloud, but something we'll be happy to talk a little bit more about. From a data center footprint perspective, the cloud does give you the ability to either consolidate or hopefully close down to a certain degree, certain data center footprint, and reduce those upfront investments that you need to make in your data center capacity from both the data center facility space and from a server capacity perspective. When we're thinking about cloud and productivity of your employees, we think the cloud can unlock both easier management for folks like VM administrators and storage administrators, as well as increased productivity for developers. The ability to shift to DevOps models is significantly improved in the cloud, and the real time and value savings of a cloud transformation can have not just a employee satisfaction benefit, but also a productivity benefit. From a sustainability perspective, Microsoft's ability to manage the cloud at scale and drive real sustainable initiatives can give you the ability to improve your sustainability and to reduce your carbon footprint by utilizing Microsoft's best-in-class data center architectures. And so with that, we'll transfer over to some Q&A. So please feel free to pose questions in the chat. We have a few core questions that I think we can address while questions are materializing. So Jeff, why don't you kick it off with the first question?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most common questions we get, and it from our customer base, and more so from like some industry verticals like manufacturing and oil and gas, as well as telecommunications companies, are very focused on specific measures of success with respect to investors and analysts and whatnot. So there's a significance of transforming their capex spend to opex, so they're shifting that. So my first question is, what is that significance when we're shifting from capex to opex, and what are some of the key KPIs tied to that shift, and how are they impacted as companies start moving their workloads and seeing their budgetary allocation reclassified, if you will?
Thanks, Jeff. And this is one of the core questions we get all the time. So I'm going to give my first caveat of the evening, which is, I can't give accounting guidance. It's ultimately up to accounting firms to decide whether things are treated as capex or opex. But happy to discuss this. I think it's a really core question because it does have an impact, not just from a economics perspective, but from a process perspective as well. So capex is when you capitalize an asset. So you buy something and you would put it on your balance sheet. Opex is typically when you just expense something. So think of it as, never going on a balance sheet. It's not put on an asset and it just expensed directly. And so many companies have a preference one way or the other for capex or opex. Now, from an economics perspective, we tend to view opex as favorable from a cash flow perspective because you don't need to outlay capital up front. You don't need to spend cash today for something you'll use in the future. So operating expenditures can unlock that cash flow timing benefit. You're able to shift out in time your expenses. Now, the reality, however, is people have KPIs tied to capex or opex. One that you'll often hear measured or mentioned is EBITDA. EBITDA is effectively what we term operating income. but you add back your depreciation and amortization. And so when you shift from capex to opex, capex is a type of spend that generates depreciation and amortization. And so when you're spending in capital, you get to add back a portion of your spend for the purpose of an EBITDA KPI. And so when you're shifting to the cloud, you have to understand how that may impact that KPI. Typically what will happen is, because you're now moving spend from depreciation and amortization over to cloud spend, your EBITDA will be impacted. It may reduce. Now, the reality is EBITDA is just a metric. It's not cash flow. It's not a real economic thing. And so, the key thing I like to reframe and restate over and over again is, servers don't grow on trees. CapEx isn't free, but it is an important KPI. And so the reality when we're thinking about the CapEx to OpEx shift, and when you're working with finance business partners, one of the really important things to consider is, how do we plan out a transition? How do we think about EBITDA as it transforms over time? And how do we make sure we're flashing the right shift and we're understanding how that will shift over time? We want to optimize for things like cash flow, positive NPV. And so that is the decision to make, but it's important to understand how your KPI will be impacted and to consider and plan for that change. It's also important, I just add one final point here. You tend to budget capital expenditures and operating expenditures in different budgetary allocations. And so you often will need to plan for shifts from capital budgets over to operating expense budgets when you make a cloud move. And so it's really important to pull your finance counterparts in early so that they can understand and model out some of that impact. Nothing from a financial perspective is typically fixed. You just need to make sure you're planning with your finance partners in order to really understand what the true constraints are and how you can adjust to the shifting model from a financial and KPI perspective.
Right. And just to add to some of your comments, I've had customers do detailed fiduciary projections of moving the workloads and using discovery tools to really analyze the workloads that they have on premise and how they map to Azure. And in several cases, what they discovered is that shift from CapEx to OpEx was relatively minimal in the larger picture, especially like in the manufacturing industry where they have large factories and facilities and whatnot. When they make a data center change, it was relatively minimal in the larger picture. But to really realize that and understand the overall impact, you really have to do some of like the detailed modeling type of exercises. Daniel, there's a follow-up question that we had as we were talking, and I'll read it and see if we could tackle this one.
Thank you.
Will shifting from CapEx to OpEx over a period longer than 3 years, keeping in mind that historically that bare metal investment, that capital expenditure for the physical gear and servers and sometimes even the networking gear has historically been 3 years. But if we extend that past that 3-year period to a 4 or 5 year period, will it have a dramatic impact to like the business case and the projections and influence those decisions of going to the cloud?
It does make it an impact. I think the reality is you have to look at both your depreciable lives and your useful life, and you have to consider what is the underlying economics of the server use case. So if you're extending your server useful lives to 5, 6, 7 years, that's obviously going to decrease your costs per server. Now, it may come at the expense of potentially increased maintenance costs. I would say that we generally can still see benefits in certain cases, but it really comes down to how you use your capacity on-prem and how it translates to the cloud. And so when we think about scalability in the cloud, it's going to have some dependency on, can you actually reduce the amount of server you need, right? If I have a server on premise, does that need to be the same amount of capacity in the cloud? I often will over provision resources in an on-premise environment because I know I may have growth over time. I may have workloads that seem like they need 8 cores, but you know what? Realistically, they needed 4, and we just were a little bit nervous and we wanted to make sure the capacity was there if we needed it. You also will see workloads spike and change over time. And so if something needs 4 cores in November, but during a holiday peak in December, it needs 8 cores, well, you're stuck with the 8 cores for pretty much the whole year in that on-premise scenario. So it's not always just about shifting up and down or taking advantage of rapid scalability. It's also about making sure you're able to take advantage of the difference between mean and peak. And so we see positive business cases, I think, even with, beyond 3-year depreciable lives, but it does depend upon the, underlying footprint you have, and you have to really consider the holistic case that you're building. How can you optimize your capacity, and how can you use cloud native tools in order to drive further efficiencies?
Yeah, exactly. And also an additional thing to keep in mind is when you run those server components, those bare metal components, the hypervisor bare metal, for example, for the longer period of time, you're also increasing a potential risk, a mean time before failure. You're getting to that end of term. So while the financials may look good to run your gear for a longer period of time, a lot of the models that I've seen that are customer generated aren't taking that risk factor of failure into perspective. So if you have a revenue generating workload, that's certainly something to keep in mind.
It looks like we have another question that's in the chat, so I'll read this one to you, Jeff, and let you address it. So the question states, we're using the TCO calculator to move customers to the cloud, and notice that under a certain threshold of VMs, a move to the cloud can be cost ineffective. Based upon your experiences, how can you discuss this matter with customers?
Yeah, a lot of the online TCO calculators have very generic values for kind of mid-sized data center footprints. So what we find in most cases with customers, especially if you have a large data center footprint, or if you have specific agreements with OEMs in the acquisition of gear and great price points, we tend to take that original output, that canned output from those TCO calculators and tool sets, and customize them to some extent to make them to tailor them to your particular financials and budgetary allocations. So certainly as you look at these online tools and even the TCO calculator on Azure.com, look at it as a starting point, and then do a little bit of digging, go through those multiple layers of the onion and see if there's aspects that weren't included, or if there's financial components that weren't necessarily representative of your particular environment. And we tend to see in a bulk of the cases, or a high percentage of the cases, that there will be a cash flow reduction, even if you look at a lift and shift, where you're freeing up that cash flow over time. So certainly do that deeper level of digging.
One thing I'd add to this as well, especially around the smaller number of VMs or the smaller number of servers migrating, I think oftentimes there's a perception that if you're only moving a small amount of servers, maybe you can only address the direct server spend or the power spend. The reality is that I think we always want to encourage customers to look at and understand opportunity cost as well. And the reality is oftentimes you have to either increase your footprint over time in terms of, let's say, data center space. And so while costs may appear fixed in the short term if you're only moving a small number of workloads, the reality is longer term, you either need to grow space, or you could consolidate your space and reduce some of what we call those fixed costs. Right. And so consider making sure that the business case is holistic, and that's not just considering the very, very short term variable costs, but how you could longer term plan, even with a smaller migration footprint, consolidating space, consolidating some of the footprint, and driving out cost over a longer time frame. So really thinking about the business case not just as a 6-month exercise, but thinking about over 3 years, what does that transition look like? Because realistically, I always joke, like, if you go long enough term, everything's variable. There's no fixed cost from a 10-year perspective, right? You can change that. It just needs to be planned for and assessed. And so that's why we think the business case is a critical component, because you need to understand when your data center leases will expire. When are those expiration dates, or when can you refine your capacity footprints, and making sure you're adjusting and you're planning your business around those key points in time is absolutely critical.
Yeah, exactly. You probably saw me smiling when Daniel was mentioning business case. It's one of the terms I'm not totally fond of, even though it makes sense and defines a deliverable. I like to create that longer term financial roadmap, that plan that I can measure over time. So as we're taking data centers through migration periods, we have a double mortgage situation where we're still paying some of those on-premise costs and some of that depreciation, like capex classification, and then we're taking on cloud meters, so it's like additional costs, and then we're also paying for the execution of the move, the migration. And in these financial models that we tend to create, we want to create that timeline map to it so we can measure it at a very incremental level and show success, versus just having a snapshot in time of, yeah, does this make sense, or is this darn thing cheaper? I want to be able to measure it at a very incremental level. So certainly keep that in mind. And that ties to one of the other questions I wanted to bring up, is typically it's perceived that cloud spend has like peaks and valleys, that there's this fluctuation of overall spend with respect to overall cloud billing. And with that in mind, what approaches can we take to actually make that billing, that month-over-month billing, more consistent so we don't get that fluctuation in overall cost? Because historically, when we operated data centers, we're used to having a static cash flow, something that was very predictable. So these peaks and valleys are relatively terrifying at times. So what are your thoughts on that, Daniel?
Yeah, so I think we've got some really, I think, core things. One of them is reserved instance capacity. So for workloads that are very consistently running, let's say 24/7, reserved instances, you actually don't have to pay for them up front, so you can still retain the overtime payments, but you can know that you'll have that consistent cash flow over time for a certain amount of capacity. And so that helps to smooth a portion of your spend out. You'll be, consuming at a lower price point. Reserved instance capacity for 3-year reserved instances can be, between a 50 and a 70% discount off of the pay-as-you-go pricing. So significant discounts, and it'll be consistent across the board. Now, the reality is, part of the benefit of the cloud is your ability to scale up and down. And so I always say, you don't want a completely flat line. You can get a completely flat line if you just, waste money and, consume more than you need. What you really want is, have your consistent workloads at the most optimized price point possible. And then when you temporarily need more capacity in order to fulfill seasonal demand, for example, you spin up additional resources, and you're using more in those times because you have increased IT demand. The reality is what's happening on premises in those, seasonal peaks, that you're setting your baseline of what you need to spend. In reality, if you were optimized in an on-premise scenario in the hypothetical world, you would reduce that capacity, following the seasonal peak. But you can't do that. You don't have that flexibility because everything's a fixed model for the most part. And so with the cloud model, you have the ability to set a baseline of spend, yes, but then when you need that extra capacity, you then have a little bit of what we'd call, a seasonal, uptick in spend that's just tied to your increased consumption periods.
Cool, excellent, thank you. And we had a question pop up, and it involves one of the services at the PaaS layers that I'm personally very passionate about, and it involves Azure Functions. So the question is what is the cost benefit to migrate a legacy console application to serverless functions? Now, for those that aren't familiar with serverless functions and Azure Functions, it can represent business logic and complex logic that is basically doesn't have a UI. It can connect into a backend data source and do some ETL processing, or process some complex business logic within an entire application suite. And it doesn't require a VM or whatnot. Now, if we think about legacy applications on premise, it always involves some level of compute unit. You had to have a VM or something to actually host it. While in the cloud, that's not necessarily required. So you no longer have to actually manage the base OS, patching, and all of the above. So in that particular scenario, you're already getting a benefit from an operational perspective, from an IT service management perspective. Second is, as you move your code, that business logic that's within the function itself into a hosted function in the cloud, you have the benefit of like 1 + 1 = 3, meaning you can connect to more sources like multi-factor authentication and services that historically were cost prohibitive to actually deploy on premise, you have easy access to. Now, when you think about the cost benefit over time, I typically evangelize to customers, well, start with like a lift and shift to kind of free up their current budgetary allocation and use that freed up allocation to reinvest and modernize workloads into those PaaS layers over time, taking both a technical and financial conservative approach over time and get those benefits of like hosted functions. So great question, and thanks for asking that one.
And just to touch on one more thing, one of the things I like to talk about when it goes from migrating a standard legacy application on-prem or workload on-premise to, let's say, serverless, or even containerization or any of the past model, is one of the things you're effectively doing is increasing the amount of elasticity you can take advantage of. You're making it much easier to scale up capacity and down capacity to only use precisely what you need. And so it's effectively giving you the ability to just consume the resources that you want to directly consume. And so kind of the further to the scale that you go from, a traditional application with just, a very consistent allocation to containers, to app services, over to something like serverless, gives you increased ability to just directly only pay for exactly what you need. So you're more directly attuning your spend to your underlying resource utilization. And that's a lot of times where that benefit can come from.
Yeah, and it really represents those waves of modernization, both technical and keeping in mind also financial, how you apply budget to those things, those technical evolutions of change over time. Because as we mentioned, they're both mutually intertwined. So with about 5 or so minutes left, we have a couple more great questions. Next one I want to propose, and another question that we commonly get from customers is, do I need to pay upfront for reservations? Because we have 1 or 3 year reservations for multiple types of meters in Azure, including compute units, VMs, as well as even transactional stores, even at the PaaS layers. But do we have to pay upfront for those reservations for those 1 or 3 year terms? And how does that flexibility work?
Yeah, so I think the easy answer is no, you don't need to pay up front for those reservations. So you can pay over time on a monthly basis. And so you'll, have a 1 or a 3 year reservation for a certain VM family or a certain VM, and you pay for that over time, or you have the option, I should say, to pay for that over time. From a flexibility perspective, I think one of the really unique things about our reserved instances is how flexible they are. There is some contractual changes that occur when you shift from one VM family to another or one region to another, but you actually have the ability to take an existing reservation and change the capacity that you're using. So even if you start with an E32, V3 VM today, right, a certain type of VM, you can actually change the VM type and location to another VM family or another location. So you retain a significant amount of flexibility. And so one of the key things to think about is you don't actually need to precisely know your compute needs for 3 years into the future in order to take advantage of that lower price point. You can take advantage of the lower price point and then use the flexibility to shift the underlying VM family or region when you need to make a change based upon your workload needs.
Yeah, great question, great answer, and just to reemphasize the fact that you're not locked into that particular configuration for like that 3 year term, because to be fair, that's a hard one to guess, up front. And that's what we had to do historically with on-premise data centers, so we don't want to replicate that same behavior. So great answer there, and kind of tying into that, we also enable customers to fully leverage their licensing investment over time. We have the Azure Hybrid benefit that enables you the portability of not just Windows licenses, but also SQL licenses and some Linux versions as well. So that pre-existing investment that you have in your licensing infrastructure, that asset that you have, you can fully leverage that in the longer term as well.
And I do see a question saying, do you have any boilerplate business case with roadmaps for reference? We don't have any directly in this presentation. On the azure.com/cloud economics page, there is a video on there that we walk through kind of how we view the illustrative transformation. So it's a purely illustrative case, but kind of walks at a high level through how we think about the transition from on-prem to cloud. And when we're building out a business case, how do we typically lay out that cash flow transformation over time? So reducing capital expenditure and operating expenditure, increased Azure spend, potentially migration costs, and then how does that compare with a status quo on-premise scenario that there's kind of no move tied to. So again, that's the azure.com/cloud economics portal. We'll have the link in a slide in a second, but that does have some of that content and resource within one of the videos on the page.
Yep, and I just dropped it into the announcements window as well, so you're able to have that connection.
And I believe we've got just a minute left, so why don't we go to this last slide, and Jeff, I'll let you just kick off with the resources.
Oh, absolutely. So Thank you everyone for your time and joining us today, and wonderful questions that we had come across the chat window. And again, thank you, Daniel. I presented, I think in the last probably 7 or 8 months, probably well over 40 hours of like recorded content and just amazing amount of like customer meetings, and it's always a pleasure. I always learn something new each and every time within each one of our discussions. And certainly continue looking to learn with Microsoft at aka.ms/WAC, learn at Ignite. And then also that link that I dropped in the chat window is also available in this slide deck, azure.com/cloud economics for future depth of content. So with that, I'll hand it back to Daniel and see if he wants to have any closing comments.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for joining this call. I think it's absolutely critical to consider the financial impact of a transformation. And so considering how it will impact not just your technical journey, but the financial journey that your business will go on is absolutely critical. So we appreciate the time you spend here. Highly encourage taking advantage of the resources we have, and please always feel free to reach out to Microsoft. There's lots of great resources and we're always happy to have the conversation. So thank you all for your time.